Welcome to another edition of EO Convos. I'm Matt Cropp, the co-executive director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, and today we'll be talking with Oliver Goodenough, who is a legal professional who's been doing a lot of work around the intersection of kind of technology and the law. He's a research professor at Vermont Law School, works at the Gravel and Shea legal practice, and has a number of other kind of academic and entrepreneurial pursuits that he's been involved in. So we'll be learning a little bit about his work, his background, and kind of the potential intersections, and there's probably a number, of some of the work that he's been doing around kind of blockchain and the sort of the connection of blockchain technology and legal structures that could have a lot of relevance to kind of opportunities for broad-based ownership. So welcome, Oliver, and thanks for being here.
Well, thanks so much for including me in your programming. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so before we get into your current work, do you want to give a little background as to your path into this world and the nature of your interests professionally and personally on this front?
Sure, thank you. I'm a lawyer, as you said. I'm a lawyer by training. I'm a special counsel with the Burlington, Vermont-based firm of Gravel and Shea, where I'm working particularly in these areas of enterprise organizations using blockchain and other technological bases. I'm also a professor. I'm at this point a research professor at Vermont Law School, where my work and teaching are in intellectual property, business organizations, social enterprise, that kind of cluster of things. Also a fair bit of time with legal technology. I'm also affiliated with, as you mentioned, with other places. Not terribly important to go into that. The key for this conversation is that for many years I've taught and worked around the questions of how do you set up an enterprise? And I choose the word enterprise intentionally to cover everything from a nonprofit to a for-profit to an employee-owned structure to whatever it may be, that people come together to have a joint organization to accomplish something, hopefully something productive. And in the context we're really talking here, something often in a context that we might well call business, where we've got people delivering goods, services, retail, wholesale, manufacturer, whatever it may be. But that question of enterprise, how you organize it and run it, is one that is traditionally and sort of narrow-mindedly answered in the United States through, there'll be a corporation and someone will own it and other people will work for it, and that's what it will look like. But while that is one of the potential models, it's not the only one by a long shot. There are all kinds of other ways to structure work, as you well know, that how you come together, how you finance it, all those elements can be stuck together under all kinds of different approaches and rules, and provided people are comfortable with it and do it, and it turns out to be productive, and there's no reason to pick the classic corporation over any of these other things. It's just a lack of imagination sometimes rather than not. So anyway, that's been my interest. Looking into how these work has also led me to, when combined with my other chief area of interest, which has been legal and financial technology, the use of technology as a way to structure legal relations, to structure business formats. So we are used in this world to dealing with paper-based stuff where we set out an agreement, we set out a charter, whatever it may be. We put a structure of words together, we put them out there on a piece of paper. That technology is moving us beyond that in many contexts. So again, the ability to use technological basis for the underpinning for this structure has been another piece of my interest, and those two come together to create the kind of possible synergy we're talking about today.
Great. So one of the key things that you that you were involved with creating is this kind of I think Vermont was one of the first places to really sort of pursue this, was the blockchain-based LLC structure. Do you want to give a little background as to sort of what that is and how that came about? And maybe we can talk a little bit for folks who are less familiar with sort of like, it's a term that's kind of come up more and more in the past decade. It's really kind of, I think, more or less about a decade old in terms of its, commercial applications as a technology, but what that what drove that and what it is.
Sure. If you don't mind, maybe I'll take a minute or two just to talk a little bit about the blockchain, to give a little bit of an introduction to folks who don't necessarily follow what that technology is. People have probably heard it. I mean, it's one of those words that's out there in the current it's zeitgeist, but it's not necessarily one that people are familiar with. And if they are, they're sometimes familiar with just a very limited application that we see in the cryptocurrency field. Blockchain is a very interesting way. It's a term that is sometimes used. Distributed ledger is another sort of more general term that can be used for that. It is a way of keeping records so that they are both generally available to the world, transparent and open, and very hard to hack. Those are two things which are often in tension in the database world. How do you keep a piece of something open to the public and make it hard to hack? In the paper world, imagine a record that's in a file someplace that anybody can go to and look at. If someone wanted to falsify that, they'd take the record out of the file and they'd just put their own version in, and then the next person looked at it. Well, what is that? And that's a problem that's in the, as I say, in the paper world as well. We take care of that through a variety of techniques like notarization or filing with the county clerk or the town clerk in Vermont, some kind of trusted repository where it's gonna be there. Even in the paper world, again, it's subject to hacking, but it's hard to do. In the electronic world, as we know from the past, hacking is not all that difficult. We solve this by the technique of distributing the information across a number of holders. So that's the distributed ledger piece. If we want to make sure that it's hard to hack, we hand it not to one computer, but we hand it to 50 computers, and have those computers all store it through a mechanism that makes it very clear that it's been properly done. And then if we want to go in and hack, we've got to hack 50 computers, not just one, to really change the record. So that's the core piece of blockchain and distributed ledger, is that we take the recordation and we spread it out. Other pieces of this involve also the chain aspect, so that we're registering not just the current registry, but each time or periodically we re-register the whole chain so that the background information is preserved, so that if we hack the current one, that we can go back to recordations and find that actually it's different 2 recordations back. So we have a historical record as well as the current record that's very hard to hack. Also, another element in this is typically that rather than recording the entire piece of information, we record some digital representation of it, often called a hash. So we're taking a long document and converting it into 15 symbols, which are generated through some kind of adding and subtracting the number of commas and taking some kind of way that's just going to be very, very hard to substitute. So you put all those things together and you've got a record that is public and hard to hack. That has led to a number of applications, including things like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, where the record, you don't need a bank in the middle. You just kind of because the chain keeps track of who owns what. But it also can sit behind all kinds of other applications. Recording property, we talked about, you go to the town clerk. Well, instead of going to the town clerk, one could imagine a world where you went to the public blockchain. And that again would be a very sturdy way of keeping that kind of record and keeping it against hacking. The another piece of that you could do is then use it to keep track of who owns a company. The ownership structure of a company could be then transferred into this kind of thing, and the ownership could be made very clear and open while being also subject to alteration. And this brings us now to this very interesting piece where blockchain can sit behind a bunch of technology to keep track of the ownership of a company. And to adjust that ownership by use and by contribution of work and by contribution of money, and you can begin to have a way of keeping track of who's entitled to the benefits of a joint organization that is much more flexible while remaining robust than the traditional sort of share structures and things like that. So that leads us then into this possibility that we can have business organizations that use this. The second piece of the puzzle, that's sort of piece number one, is that the technology lets you do a bunch of this. The second piece of the puzzle is that a lot of experimentation has been going on, both in terms of cryptocurrencies and in others, without seeking a legal recognized wrapper, if you like, or legally recognized container for this to go forward. And this is dangerous because I know the blockchain utopians who are out there sort of say, oh, we'll just do it on the line and nobody will, we don't need the law. Well, as the old song says, I fought the law and the law won. The law is likely to come in and say, well, you are something if you're doing this. And there's a default law on the books in all the US states, which says basically, if you are a business that hasn't chosen some other kind of organization, if you're a business involving more than one person cooperating to act as some of the ways owners act, they're going to call you a partnership. And the problem with being called a partnership is that there's a bunch of consequences that come from that, not the least the fact that everybody is jointly and severally liable for all of the debts of the partnership. So you don't have any of the limited liability that you would get from a corporation or a limited liability company or a limited partnership, those structures which mean that participants aren't generally liable. Yes, they're liable for their own default, they're liable for whatever they put into the company, but their house and car isn't also liable. But if you're a partnership, that's true. Your house and car are liable if the thing goes the wrong way. So there are other rules about fiduciary duties and tax and a bunch of things which come together to say that if you kind of back yourself into a default partnership, you're really going to get outcomes you're not interested in by and large, and that you'd like to prevent. So you put together the fact that the world is the blockchain and distributed ledger technology make all kinds of experimentation around enterprise structuring possible. And then you put into place the fact that, by the way, those experiments need to have a legally recognized wrapper, or they're going to be subject perhaps to some very unfortunate consequences. And you come up with this saying, well, what could we do? And the thing that Vermont did was to enact a law called the blockchain-based LLC, which basically says we can do a blockchain-based LLC. We have some special rules that will help define what blockchains typically need about various kinds of, how the chain is structured, how you fork it, a variety of different sort of core things for a blockchain. And then you can, the plus is that it also says you can run everything through the machine once you set up online governance becomes a completely possible thing. And all of that potential we were talking about, where you have the possibility of using blockchain-based or other technologically mediated techniques for keeping track of ownership, all the things, the governance, the pieces we were talking about, all of that becomes officially recognized as being possible through software. So you have both the authorization of all that and a legal structure which is suited to providing some of the protections we talked about.
So one question I have on that is, oftentimes I feel like I hear, from attorneys that the LLC is something of a Swiss Army knife. It's something that can be super flexible, can be used for many things. So kind of in maybe a little more specifically, what were the things about the kind of traditional LLC structure that just kind of that it was the limitation that made sense to add this new?
Two or three things, and indeed, you may well be able to do some of this with a traditional LLC structure. I'm not arguing you can't. What it does do is it provides specific recognition that some iffy areas are okay. For instance, actually, the traditional Vermont LLC law was quite permissive about using technology. That was something the legislature did back around 2012. Using software. This goes another step and really says not only software, but blockchain operations, and just says it explicitly. There's also interesting questions about the role of a member. In a traditional LLC, the member owes fiduciary duties to the other members and shouldn't be both a contractor with the company and a member of the company. The blockchain LLC makes it clear that you can do both, which is very suitable to things like crypto nodes, where the nodes and miners often have their own trading that they do and their own ownership, and you don't want, you want to be able to keep those separate, and the BBLLC makes that clear. It also makes clear that taking part as a member doesn't necessarily locate you in Vermont. there's a kind of a presumption under tax laws and other things that, by the way, if you're a member in a company that's doing business in a particular spot, you're doing business in that spot too. And if you're a Chinese-based node in a cryptocurrency or Israeli-based participant in a DAO, you don't necessarily want to be doing business in the United States. And to the extent that the state law can handle that, the Vermont law is explicit about that. Again, federal law may have its own viewpoints, but so there's a number of these issues that we surfaced. I say we because I was the Center for Legal Innovation at Vermont Law School, did the original paper to the legislature that proposed some of this. The legislature took it from there. The Vermont Bar Association got involved. There's a bunch of different players putting input into all of this. But what we as a group tried to do was to identify where those slightly awkward points were in the current LLC, and then provide an explicit solution to them. Again, as you say, it is possible and arguable that those awkward points could be overcome. It's nice not to have to make that argument, but rather just point to the statute and say, hey, they're here. So again, that was the point of the statute.
Cool. So it seems like there's kind of two categories here. One is that these sort of blockchain technologies and the legal kind of frameworks around them, or wrappers, as you put it, allow for certain things that have been done for many, many years to be done in a different way, more efficiently and more granularly, that sort of thing. And then there's some kind of elements that are sort of like newly possible because of this technology. In the first category, it sounds like, okay, so rather than say like issuing a share certificate or something like that, you kind of register that ownership in this blockchain, or for something like governance, saying, all right, so everyone needs to vote, so we have a record of who has the votes, and count the votes and register the votes, so you have kind of a transparent, some level of transparent system versus counting paper ballots, right? Kind of
Yep.
moving those sorts of practices onto the internet. Are there other kind of applications of those sort of more traditional things that you think are kind of relevant to this conversation?
Well, one is the fact that traditionally it's hard to kind of adjust ownership elements. And I use elements because, again, ownership isn't a single thing. You can have voting, which is separate from your participation, which is separate from your contribution, which, anyway, you can mix and match a bunch of these elements. They tend to be relatively static once they're set. And one of the things that this technology can do is to make those things dynamic. So that if you stop participating in the organization for a while, you can, your rights in it may go down over time. If you participate, well, they can come back up. So it allows a kind of an adjustment that a vision of what may be a fair way to allocate these elements on a kind of a continually adjustable basis, rather than having some kind of hard formula. Again, you could do that on paper, but again, but just keeping track of it on paper and all, it's just a daunting thing. It becomes relatively straightforward with the machine to do that. So again, there are I don't know if that's old or new, but it's one of the things that this kind of technology can do. It can also bring people in a little more casually. If you want to have an organization that the kind of people can flow in and out of a little bit more fluidly, this again can make that possible. So a number of the tasks and ways we did things that we kind of bumped up against the practicalities of paper become less constraining here.
And so what are the kind of then the newer sort of applications, both in terms of like for existing types of companies, like things that they wouldn't have been able to do at all before versus greater or lesser efficiency, but also sort of in terms of like, are there, again, I feel like as you mentioned in the beginning of this, there's this tendency to think about, the forms of organization that are available to us now are kind of natural and they're the things, but in reality, lots of them, the LLC's only been around for a few decades, right? The corporation's older, but it's still sort of a creature of, the last few centuries,
yes,
right? Absolutely. So from a kind of historical perspective, there's always kind of room for like new things to come in. And then even in the employee ownership world, we work with employee stock ownership plans and ESOPs and working costs primarily, but recently there's been this kind of employee ownership trust model that's been kind of imported from the UK in the last maybe 5 years. So, we see sort of shifting possibilities for what's,
Absolutely, and I have absolutely no argument with any of those. I think they're all very worthy and are good solutions given a particular set of understandings about what a company can be.
Mhm.
I think that this opens up that whole question about what a company can be. I mean, again, employee ownership still says we've got employees. I mean, that kind of classic company employee relationship is largely intact. It's intact with the benefits flowing in different places. It's lovely. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that it is a hybrid of this traditional way to redistribute the ownership, the control, the benefits, all the things that are that part of that bundle we call ownership back into the folks working at the place rather than the people who put up the money, which is the classic capitalist solution. There's, God did not come down from heaven and touch J.P. Morgan, and say, capitalism is the way the world is. It's a useful structure. We've mined it reasonably thoroughly. There are other useful structures that may supplant it. So particularly in platform style businesses where the software is the business in a sense, and which scales up by participation, one could imagine a world in which participants, let's use the word participants rather than the word employee, have those that more of that bundle of governance and benefit, et cetera, et cetera. Without a Facebook style social interaction platform could just as easily be owned by its participants as owned by a centralized management team. And if it was governed in a variety of ways, and one could imagine a world in which the management team had some greater participation, but that the individuals did, kind of what we would think of as a more co-op style model. But you could use the software and the new business organization forms as a way to create exactly what we've just talked about. And if you backed it up against a blockchain-based back end where you had the benefits of openness and robustness and hard to hack, then one could imagine all kinds of different economic arrangements that could be done. One of the lovely things about American enterprise law is that it has classically taken the position that it's going to be enabling rather than prescriptive. That rather than saying, here is the form, particularly in the last half century or so, we've really had this notion of, hey, we're going to create a toolkit, a Tinker Toy box, whatever you want to say, that we take the pieces out, stick them together, and oh my goodness, we could have a new form we hadn't thought of. If clever people do it, and if we've got core rules saying no fraud, a bunch of other sort of core protections against this, then let it happen. There's a principle called generativity, which actually Jonathan Zittrain has explored with respect to the internet. The generativity principle says, be open to systems that can create things you didn't anticipate when you created the system. The language actually is generative because you can put sentences together that nobody else has thought of yet. The genetic code is generative because you can stick it together in different ways. You got the 4 alphabet pieces. You can end up with people or you elephants or green algae. All kinds of different things can be done with that. And what I think what we're seeing is the idea again. Let's create some very flexible legal structures within which all kinds of stuff can happen. As is pointed out by Zittrain, nobody anticipated Facebook or Twitter or Google, for that matter, when they created the standards that allowed the internet to happen. Nobody, I think, is necessarily anticipating where clever people will take this. So let's see. It's exciting to think about. Could we have forms of enterprise that were post-capitalist and post-employable? Employment is a legal construct which has had some utility over the centuries, but it's again one that has downsides. Maybe there's another whole way to think about it that is not in that bucket. So yeah, we can use these new technologies to put that bucket together in a traditional way. We can imagine the new, and both in law practice and in academia and in public policy, at least my vision is we should be imagining the new and trying it out. You know, creating some playgrounds to have some experimentation go forward. And again, if you keep core principles like no fraud, no things like that are important to keep. Hopefully, we can prevent a lot of the harm from happening. Although, again, there'll be some mistakes and there'll be some things that crash, and that's what innovation sadly requires.
So in terms of, it sounds like, your impression, and I would certainly agree, is that there's a lot of opportunity for kind of exploring new ways of organizing people and in economic activity going forward. It sounds like you had mentioned to me that you've been working on one kind of project in particular where the operating agreement is kind of being open sourced to a certain extent, and the model.
If I may, we've worked with a client called DORG, D-O-R-G, who have set up what we believe is certainly the first fully legally recognized DAO in the United States. A DAO, a distributed autonomous organization. They are in the blockchain community. There's been a lot of discussion about this as a version of this kind of new style organization we've been talking about. There are a number of companies out there that are doing that have software platforms that enable these things. The people at DORG are actually software engineers in that kind of a context and do consulting around this. We worked with them and hopefully created something that really does stretch all of the good parts of the Vermont blockchain law and allowed that to happen. They are open to sharing it. They have authorized, they're very open source style people. They've authorized the sharing of their operating agreement with that. And again, we've gone along with that with their wishes. So again, something that's available. If people are interested, they can get in touch with us. They can get in touch with the folks at DORG, and we'll see. We can pursue that a bit further if folks are interested.
And so for existing employee-owned companies that are thinking about, okay, so our business models, fairly stable. Our corporate structure is mostly working for us, and are kind of interested in the kind of, I'd say, maybe more gradualist sort of advances that blockchain kind of allows, right? The governance, the tracking ownership, having your share, or something like that. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts on sort of what would be good sort of next steps for folks in wanting to kind of explore those sorts of options and opportunities and technologies?
The first step, I think, would just be to educate themselves a bit about the blockchain and distributed ledger technology and what would be possible. Secondly, there are a number of companies out there, as I say, doing pieces of this. Have a conversation with them. Have a educational conversation. Make it clear before you say, "Look, we're not going there for 2 years. It's okay." But let me know what and really come to grips with would these solutions be useful for that. If you've got a small employee-owned company of 10 people, all in the same manufacturing thing, turning out a specialty kind of widget, and they all show up in the same spot every day, and it's working for them. I don't think that putting that on a blockchain is going to help them much. But if you've got a 300-member company with about, with distributed locations and some work and some, governance concerns, and maybe it's not working for them terribly well, then exploring these options could well be worthwhile. So I would educate themselves about what the technology can do, what all the rest of that is, and then at a certain point, if they feel that they're comfortable going forward, then they get in touch with us at Gravel and Shea or a number of other firms that would be good at that, and say, can you help us structure? And then that's probably the time to call in the lawyers once you've defined the problem well enough to make it worth the expenditure you're talking about.
And sort of thinking about the kind of going forward, there's the opportunities to kind of get those things like nailed down a little bit better and stronger. But are there any other sort of just projects out there that you see as beyond the one that you mentioned, as doing kind of really interesting, neat stuff around new forms of kind of being able to share that kind of ownership in the gig economy, other things like that?
Yeah, I mean, the gig economy can have a bad name because it often is, viewed as being, this sort of temporary thing. for some people, it matches perfectly, and these DAOs can be a way to provide stability, some stability within a gig economy style set of work. So again, that's a piece. There are centers doing this in New York. There's a bunch of folks in Berlin. In fact, this past week, I believe, has been the Berlin Blockchain Week. I'm sitting in Vermont rather than in Berlin this week, but there we are. A bunch of the folks who are active in this are in Berlin and talking to each other about it. All of this kind of thing. San Francisco Bay Area has a center for this. There's I think the Starfish Collaborative out there that does some work. There are a number of software companies. We've worked with DAOstack who do good work, but there are other folks as well. In Vermont, they're Vermont-based, although with national reach, is an organization called the Distributed Ledger Governance Association, which does this, DLGA, and again, they could be contacted and would be a conduit into some of this. There's a lot of activity around here, and as I say, my view at any rate is that that's fabulous, because it ought to be generative. It ought to be one of these things where a number of people take the Tinker Toys and stick them together, and suddenly someone built a spaceship. Whoa, how did that happen? But it would be wonderful when it does.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting moment. I think our time is just about up. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your morning to chat about this. Any final thoughts you want to share or ideas?
Yeah, the final thought that I would share is that to be effective in this space, you have to be both visionary and practical. A number of the folks who you talk to are visionary and have this idea and don't necessarily sit down and say, okay, how would you stick all the pieces together in a way that would be both technologically effective, work with human psychology, and be something that the law could wrap itself around as well. On the other hand, you have some folks who are just tied to the law or the technology. This is what we can do. And what you really want is you need to have people be effective, to be able to think both very imaginatively and then bring that imagination down to the actualities. And how would it work from a tax standpoint? How would it work from all the things that are the nitty gritty? So yeah, I've talked a lot about thinking big, but I also want to talk a bit about and make sure that the details work. And that's again maybe when you bring the lawyers in, we're not always good at thinking big, but we are often good at thinking how would it work in the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights into this. And I'm going to be very curious to see and then watch in the next few years to see if there's kind of opportunities for the employee-owned community in Vermont to sort of gain and benefit from this sort of work.
No, absolutely terrific if it can. Again, people can reimagine what space could look like a bit, or either with their existing companies or imagine that new, and then figure out how to put it into actual practice. That would be terrific.
So this has been another EO conversation with this episode 3 with Oliver Goodenough. And if you're interested in learning more about his work, there will be a link in the description on the YouTube video. But thanks for watching. And again, if you have any folks you think would be of interest to this conversation and community, trying to do this once or twice a month. So feel free to email me at matt@veoc.org. Thanks for watching, and until next time.